Today, I want to talk about a topic close to my heart, based on a research paper that I wrote in my graduate program, Best Practices to Reduce the Rates of Recidivism in the Prison Population. The researcher took on this project because they wanted to see a change in the incarceration system. This interest developed in response to seeing how other countries handle incarcerated individuals, as well as the difference in rates of crime in said places. This caused the researcher to question if what we as a country are doing is ultimately effective. The question of whether the prison environment is actually conducive to obtaining the outcome we desire also came up. The rates of reoffending for individuals in prison are appalling. Should we be punishing or preventing? This is a debate worth having. Although this project is focused on interventions within the system, such as mindfulness training and gardening practices, there are alternatives that were not discussed, such as addictions court and the services that they offer through networking. These services can include living accommodations, employment opportunities, therapy, and many more services that can be utilized for successful outcomes. From a trauma-informed lens, the researcher had a hard time conceptualizing how we expect positive outcomes in such a negative and hostile environment. From the researcher's perspective, if we don't expect children who live in hostile environments to be unaffected and carry on to be successful regardless of their living environment, why do we expect the opposite for people in prisons, both state and federal? The researcher believes that this issue is multifaceted, meaning it transcends politics, economics, and mental health. It could be argued that our primary intent is individual well-being. However, from an economical standpoint, we have to ask, is the cost of what we're doing effective enough keeping things the way they are? Or in other words, what is the cost-benefit analysis of keeping penitentiaries and prisons the way they are compared to what they could be? And is this the best outcome? These are all separate questions that could probably be their own study. However, as previously stated, for the purposes of this study, we are focused on incarcerated individuals and interventions that can be utilized on the incarcerated. Literature review. The available literature discusses interventions within the prison system to fight rates of recidivism that involve mindfulness techniques, animal-assisted therapies, and gardening. Articles that talked about mindfulness techniques often referred to yoga in their writings. Literature has shown caution around yoga in these sorts of environments due to concerns of safety among individuals. This is largely in part due to the need for instructors to be versed in trauma-informed care, as well as overall concerns of dangerous sexual behavior among inmates. These behaviors create additional distractions in the session. Furthermore, some poses can appear sexual, which could possibly trigger memories of previous sexual abuse or lead to sexual urges, as noted by Uso Nascimento in a personal communication on November 25, 2019. However, there is a belief that mindfulness and yoga-based treatment assist with diagnoses like ADHD, which can cause difficulty in complaining about things like institutional educational programs. A much greater proportion of prisoners are believed to suffer from attention deficit disorder or attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder than the general population. Studies have shown that practicing mindfulness techniques can reduce ADHD, according to Orti et al., 2015, page 693. Animal-assisted therapies in this context are specific to dog training programs in which inmates care for and train dogs from a local shelter in hopes that they will find homes. The idea behind this technique is to facilitate behaviors that aid in developing characteristics of caretaking. Dog training programs may improve emotion regulation due to the instant behavioral feedback that dogs provide by mirroring humans' emotions and behavior, which may foster participants' self-awareness and regulation skills, as stated by Dwindham et al. 2022 and Kruger et al. 2004, page 3. Therapies in relation to gardening had similar goals to the dog training programs. However, this approach to growth was also facilitated in other ways. In one study where gardening was the intervention, the resulting produce was utilized to offset the cost of running the prison. The produce was also donated to local food banks to get inmates out into public, where they can see their contributions and hard work are positively affecting the community. This article specifically highlighted the importance that giving back had for the inmates of this program intervention. These benefits include supporting the self-esteem and self-worth necessary to imagine a future shaped by the experience of giving back through meaningful work, as noted by Timler et al. 2019, page 443. That being said, the literature also presents some problems that require more investigation into the topic. For instance, in the topic of animal-assisted therapies, it was not discussed how inmates feel about animals in general and how that could affect treatment. Another possible concern with the literature is that a majority of prison populations consist largely of individuals with previous diagnoses of mental illness, as well as individuals with mental disabilities. It is not clear how individuals with specific mental disabilities may respond to treatments that require a certain level of internal awareness and mental cognition, specifically in relation to mindfulness-based approaches. It seems as though this intersectionality of populations should be studied in more detail in order to accurately determine the best and most ethical approaches to reducing recidivism. The last and final concern overall is that much of the literature states that in many interventions that reduce return to prison, in order to take part in these interventions, you have to meet a certain benchmark behaviorally, which may prevent individuals from benefiting or taking part in specific forms of treatment. As discussed in the literature review, this demographic needs treatment because they're forced into unsuitable living conditions, as the literature has highlighted, and the existence of prisons being overpopulated to the point that they're beyond 100% capacity. The literature also discussed some major reasons for incarceration, being homelessness and a lack of job security. It seems to the researcher that what we should be thinking about is the significance behind not being able to acquire the things that are necessary for life. This is not even considering the profound implications that a prison system has on mental health, or the inadequacies that could be leading individuals with an intellectual disability to end up in the prison system. In the end, this only compounds the difficulties around finding stable employment and a place to live. Torf et al. 2021 talk about some factors that could be both a population need and a concern. For instance, they cited Harvey, 2018. Simon, 2015, described how an investigation of UK prisons for men, 48% of the inmates were living in crowded cells, which were intended to be for single occupancy, p. 486. They go on to share that the US federal prison system is at 130% of design capacity. These authors remind readers that when considering the physical and mental health challenges among people who are incarcerated, it is important to note that their environmental conditions create additional physical and emotional stress. Torf et al. 2021, p. 486, Timler et al. 2019, discuss employment and its effect on being incarcerated in Canada. In Canada, crime and incarceration are highly correlated with under- and unemployment, Dowden and Blanchette, 1999, Perrault, 2009, Sapers, 2014, which are risk factors of recidivism. By utilizing this concern, the authors effectively illustrate how gardening develops the skills necessary for stable employment after time has been served. Among positive mental health effects on individuals, it was also found that gardening engenders the skills necessary for successful community reintegration, such as delayed gratification and improved social skills, self-esteem, problem-solving and decision-making. Feldbaum et al. 2011, Migura et al. 1997, Polomsky et al. 1997, Rice and Remy 1998, Sandel 2004, p. 447. As such, the provided literature directs us to the conclusion that this population and their needs center around employment-related goals, further understanding of the effects of intersectionality and environmental conditions within our prison systems. Ideally, a follow-up study would entail a mixed methods design where individuals are tested before and after completion of the intervention, so that results can be based on the progress of the same individual. Assessments may also be used in order to identify intellectual understanding as well as preference inventory that would measure overall preference towards type of treatment. And finally, individuals will be assessed on crime history so that all participants have similar criminal backgrounds. Beyond assessments, gender should also be considered as a factor that could influence end results. Participants should be asked to self-report their experience while in incarceration to gauge a better understanding of environmental factors and how people perceive the institution. It is the hope of this researcher that these varying types of assessments could illuminate factors and subsets of this population that have been vastly overlooked, both to account for any variables that could influence results and also to expand our knowledge on areas for future consideration. Due to the amount of resiliency factors that are supported during treatment involving gardening and giving back to the community, it may be beneficial to focus this specific future study in that area. It seems as though, although all these factors have been identified as population needs, available means assessments focus on the likelihood that somebody will offend or commit crimes again in the future. It also seems that when deciding proper punishment, they use this criteria as well as past criminal behavior to justify appropriate action. Desmarais et al. 2017. That being said, there are two broad categories that distinguish between approaches used by risk assessment instruments: actuarial and structured professional judgment. The actuarial approach represents a mechanical model of risk assessment in which offenders are scored on a series of items that were most strongly associated with recidivism in the development samples. Then, total scores are cross-referenced with actuarial risk tables. Desmarais et al. 2017, p4. Something to note, however, is that this article also shared that after doing these assessments, scoring is more based on clinical judgment of the data than actual scores. Risk assessment instruments also can be differentiated by the type and content of their items, such as risk, protective, static, and dynamic factors. Desmarais et al. 2017, p4. Research questions. Along with many possible research questions, or just some examples that have led the direction of this study. What interventions are currently being used and how effective are they? What are the reasons people are being incarcerated, and in what areas do we have to continue to grow? What are other countries doing that we are not? What are successful interventions that are being utilized that we could theoretically implement in the United States? Social justice. It is the belief of this researcher that the implications of social justice in this case help support the destigmatization of inmate populations. Acknowledging conditions in these settings that individuals have to live in, and further understanding if individuals with intellectual disabilities are being put at an unfair disadvantage due to comprehension difficulty in what they're asked to do, are helpful to better understand and support these populations. Research in this field has also credited factors such as a stable job and stable living conditions as protective factors. So this study could potentially lead to further recognition of needed support for those transitioning back into civilian life. Further, to be connected with service providers, such as vocational rehabilitation, can aid in securing stable employment, which, as already previously mentioned, Canada attributes a majority of its incarceration to a lack of employment. Discussion. Not all of the interventions mentioned in the literature were effective. However, gardening did seem to be effective and further developed skills that could be utilized outside of prison life. Based upon the needs highlighted by the author, as well as the needs assessment literature that was referenced, it seems apparent that more research needs to be done. The literature highlighted some gaps in our current knowledge of the topic and some much-needed research in the area of intersectionality between intellectual disability and prison life. Some other topics that were brought up through this research were just how many inadequacies in society lead to incarceration. It is clear that this is not just an incarceration issue, this is also a homelessness issue, employment concern, disability awareness issue, and even a humane issue when we consider the environment that these inmates are forced to live in. Many institutions are way beyond full capacity, which already exacerbates what seems to be a horrible living arrangement. The literature acknowledges that although a large portion of individuals may have an intellectual disability within the population, it is also true that a large majority of this population encompasses individuals with mental illnesses. There is much work to be done. This spans not only the environment of a person, but the interventions we use. After reviewing the research, I'm not confident that the majority of interventions were utilized today, or effective enough to warrant continuation of those said interventions. I think part of the difficulty that has been seen is a lack of consideration for what would work for the specific individual. It almost seems as though we are trying to fit the individual around the intervention rather than the intervention around the individual. Beyond the social justice elements that have been previously mentioned, it may be time to reconceptualize what a prison environment should look like based on basic suitable living arrangements. Finally, we should look at interventions and treatment as gateways to other services that could provide a more desirable outcome, such as educational programs as mentioned earlier in the literature review. Results. Although there was no study conducted, based on the provided literature and their rates of effectiveness, it seems gardening programs offer the best chance for positive results. This researcher mentioned earlier, it may be possible that we would find a more significant effect on behavior than the previous gardening study. I would expect that a questionnaire focused on preferences of treatment programs and animals, like the researcher mentioned above, could highlight one's willingness for a gardening program, which may affect its overall outcome. Similarly, comparing an individual to themselves might also be useful because one could see how a specific program affected the same individual before and after engagement. A positive and significant effect would also be expected because of the characteristics involved in gardening and a gardening program. Literature has suggested that positive traits of a program, such as caretaking in relation to shelter dogs or giving back to the community in the form of produce, have a positive effect because of the facilitation and development of those skills that are ingrained within a program such as this. Some limitations are the researcher's current ability to conduct this due to funding and other factors, such as the environment and time itself. This research project would require weather that is conducive to gardening unless perhaps the facility where this takes place could find indoor gardening spaces. This would create a new variable that was not present in the previous study because participants would be indoors instead of outside, which has the possibility of creating an unknown effect on the study. Research bias. Personally, I am against the idea of incarceration unless it is for extreme crimes like murder. Because of this, I have gone into this study hoping to find positive results in reforming programs. Furthermore, the literature shows that a large majority of individuals in prison have some sort of intellectual disability. Although I do not have an intellectual disability, I do have a physical one. So I feel that I may be against prison systems for that reason as well. The last bias or potential bias that I want to mention would be my experience with homelessness and finding a job, as these are also risk factors in the literature that lead individuals to incarceration. For those interested, I have included the references for the study, references Auty, KM, Cope A and Liebling A 2017. A systematic review and meta-analysis of yoga and mindfulness meditation in prison. Effects on psychological well-being and behavioral functioning. International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology, 61, 689, 710. Duindam, H.M., Kremers, H.E., Hoev, M., and Asher, J.J., 2022. Breaking the Chains, The Effects of Training a Shelter Dog in Prison on Criminal Behavior and Recidivism. Applied Developmental Science, 26.4, 813, 826. Desmarais, S.L., Johnson, K.L., and Singh, J.P., 2017. Performance of Recidivism Risk Assessment Instruments in U.S. Correctional Settings. Psychological Services, 13.3, 206, 222. Kelsey Timler, Helen Brown, and Colleen Varco, 2019. Growing Connection Beyond Prison Walls. How a Prison Garden Fosters Rehabilitation and Healing for Incarcerated Men. Journal of Offender Rehabilitation, 58, 5, 444, 463, DOI, 10.1080/1050967420191615598. Toof, J, Mann, J, and Ousts Moore, R, 2022. Rehabilitative Yoga and Mindfulness Counseling Interventions with People Who Are Incarcerated. Journal of Creativity in Mental Health, 17 of 4, 485, 501.